Hi, everybody. My name is Mike Rappaport, and I'm the director of the Center for the Study of Constitutional Originalism. And I'd like to welcome everyone to the 14th annual You and Hazel Darling Foundation Works in Progress Conference. Every year at the beginning of the conference, I use this time to highlight what I regard as the most important events concerning originalism in the past year. This past year, of course, was a big year for originalism. Perhaps the biggest year in many a generation. The most important reason for this being a big year was that the cases the Supreme Court decided. But before getting into those cases, it's worth mentioning the thing that made those cases possible, the change in the court's personnel. The court now has, by my count, 4 originalists and 2 fellow travelers. The fellow travelers, Roberts and Alito, will often vote with the originalists. The 4 originalists divide into 2 strong originalists, Thomas and Gorsuch, and 2 more moderate originalists, Barrett and Kavanaugh, with the caveat that it's a little early to clearly define Barrett at this point. It would seem that Barrett's appointment was a key tipping point for the court. Prior to Ruth Bader Ginsburg's passing, the court looked like its originalism would be moderated by Chief Justice Roberts' position as a median justice, combined with Justice Kagan's attempt to work a moderate alliance with the chief. But when Barrett replaced Ginsburg, this reduced the power of both Roberts and Kagan. And now that Barrett is in her second full year with the court, the results have been evident. But it's not just been Barrett's appointment. This past year saw the appointment of Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson. In some ways, Jackson's appointment could be even more significant than Barrett's, since there's some evidence that she may be a progressive originalist. Her confirmation testimony sounded pretty originalist at times, and some of her questions at oral argument have also pursued originalist themes. If Jackson is a progressive originalist, this would be extremely important. She would be the first justice to be so in more than half a century since Hugo Black. If originalism is to have its full effect, it needs to be widely accepted. And it will only be widely accepted if there are both right-wing and left-wing originalists. Thus, Jackson could potentially be an important part of the expansion of originalism. Of course, only time will tell how much of an originalist she really is. While personnel changes were important in the last year, the biggest reason this past year was so important for originalism is the cases, which came out differently than they would have in the past. Cases such as Dodd and Brune and Kennedy and West Virginia. But while these cases are often seen as originalist, the reality, I think, is more complicated. While the results of these cases move the law in the direction of originalism, the reasoning of these cases is far less originalist. And here I want to suggest that one of the reasons for the court not pursuing a purer form of originalism is that it would require more overturning of precedents and thus more disruption. Let's start with Dodd, which overturned Roe versus Wade. In my view, the original meaning of the 14th Amendment does not protect the right to abortion. And therefore, Dodd reached the correct originalist result. But the reasoning in Dodd was not really originalist. It applied substantive due process to determine whether the unenumerated right to abortion was protected, and it concluded that the error that Roe committed was that it had not applied the correct substantive due process precedent. In my view, an originalist decision would have addressed the question under the Privileges or Immunities Clause. Now, it's true that the opinion did address the Privileges or Immunities Clause in a footnote, arguing that the standard under the Privileges and Immunities Clause was largely the same as under substantive due process. But an originalist footnote does not substitute for an originalist opinion. Well, why did the court rely on substantive due process rather than the Privileges or Immunities Clause. And while there are several possibilities, one important answer involves the consequences of overturning substantive due process. If the court had not merely overturned Roe, but also overturned all the substantive due process cases, that would have caused significant uncertainty, disruption, and a great outcry. Thus, the concern about overturning too many precedents too quickly may have led the court to write a much less originalist decision. A second major case was Brune, which involved the right to bear arms. Here, the court's decision was much more originalist, both in its reasoning and in its result. The court attempted to determine the original meaning without significant regard to precedent. Now, I'm not endorsing every move that the majority opinion made, as the court's decision raises some interesting questions about originalism. And the court did appear to rely on substantive due process for incorporation, but in the main, Brune was a decision that sought to determine the original meaning. Now, one reason that the Brune decision could be so originalist is that it did not interfere much with precedents and existing practices. Brune did not need to overrule any Supreme Court cases, and the decision only held unconstitutional law in 6 or 7 states, leaving the law of 43 states untouched. Finally, consider West Virginia versus EPA, the case where the court used the major questions doctrine to conclude that the Clean Air Act did not authorize EPA to require existing coal and natural gas-fired plants to limit carbon emissions to an amount that would be produced if the plant shifted to renewable energy, such as wind and solar. Now, to my mind, the major questions doctrine is not originalist statutory interpretation, because its requirement of a clear statement does not seek the original meaning. Now, I don't want to overstate my criticism of the doctrine. I do agree that originalist statutory interpretation would take into account the elephants in Mausholt's canon, that dramatic authority is not normally provided by implication. But that canon, I think, is weaker and narrower than the clear statement rule of the major questions doctrine. Instead of the major questions doctrine, West Virginia might have been decided under a strict originalist version of the non-delegation doctrine. But the court has shied away from applying that doctrine, and one possible reason is that applying a strict non-delegation doctrine would have created the risk of holding a large number of statutes and regulations unconstitutional. The major questions doctrine provides a way of avoiding this problem. While it cuts back on significant delegations, it does not render all such delegations unconstitutional. The delegations that are most clearly desired by Congress are upheld. It's only the more extravagant interpretations that were not obviously intended that are not allowed. And Congress can always, in theory at least, enact new ones. Thus, the major questions doctrine creates much less disruption than a strict non-delegation doctrine. Thus, once again, the potentially disruptive effects on precedent of a pure originalism may explain why the court has not engaged in more originalist reasoning. In my view, these cases move in an originalist direction, but not in an entirely theoretically satisfying way. Nor, even if they sought to avoid the disruption from overturning non-originalist precedent, is it clear that this is the most normatively appropriate course. Originalists need to think more about the best way of overturning non-originalist precedents without creating too much disruption. I think maybe one of the papers for the conference actually discusses this topic. Finally, another development of the past year is the strong criticism of originalism from scholars and judges. Dean Erwin Chemerinsky has written a whole book criticizing originalism entitled Worse Than Nothing. In the book, Chemerinsky writes, "Originalism is not an interpretive theory at all. It's just the rhetoric conservative justices use to make it seem that they are not imposing their own values, when they are doing exactly that. I'm not entirely sure, but I think I've just been insulted. Yes, on reflection, I think I have been. It's true that I'm not a justice, nor am I a conservative, but I do support much of what the originalist justices are doing. Another criticism comes from Justice Elena Kagan. Kagan once said, "We are all originalists now," although her version of originalism emphasized broad generalities in the Constitution, an interpretation that I believe commits the abstract meaning fallacy. But now she writes that the originalists on the court are behaving illegitimately. She writes, "If new members of a court come in and all of a sudden everything is up for grabs, then people have a right to say, 'What's going on here?' That doesn't seem very law-like." That is extremely interesting. I had not realized that Justice Kagan was such a critic of the Roosevelt and Warren courts. I had always assumed she was a supporter of those courts. In all seriousness, though, Kagan's criticism seems problematic, if not frivolous, unless it's combined with an explanation for why those earlier Roosevelt and Warren court decisions were legitimate. This is especially the case because Kagan emphasizes in the same talk that it is important to have methodologies that you apply consistently. I quite agree. To conclude, then, the past year really has been an historic one for originalism, even if it has not been one of pure originalism. It'll be interesting to see whether the court's next term continues this trend, if the court ever gets around to issuing any opinions. Okay. All right, now let me say a few words about administrative matters concerning the conference. Papers will work as follows, as they have in past years. First, the paper presenter will have approximately 10 minutes to summarize their paper. The commentator will then have approximately 10 minutes to give their comments. And then the presenter will have 2 to 3 minutes to respond. We'll then open it up for a discussion with a cue kept by the moderator.